If you look at the history of psychedelics, every human society since they have been documented has altered their consciousness. They've been a part of human culture, like how to return our diets and the way that we're living to when humans were thriving and didn't have all the modern diseases that we have. We live in a society that calls our medicine drugs and our drugs medicine. Anything that's ever actually healed me has been what our society has called drugs. And anything that has ever taken me away from my heart into my brain is what our society calls medicine. In Eastern cultures, the grief and mourning process is so elaborate and beautiful. And in Western world, everything is designed to make us forget that we're going to die.
We are live. Alli, welcome to Austin. Thanks for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here.
It's going to be great.
This is the last stop on my Austin tour before I head to the airport.
You literally bumped your flight for us, so we're very appreciative of that.
I'm stoked. This is meant to be.
And so you're in town for South by, so you've been here for 8 days, but you used to live in Austin too, right?
I did. I went to grad school here.
Okay.
So it was kind of, I didn't really fully get the full Austin experience when I went to UT. I went to UT and got my master's. So I was here for 1 year, but it was like my very internal beginning of my spiritual journey year. So I was very, I wasn't as social as I am now. But yes, I used to live in Austin and I love it here.
How is it coming back with a fresh perspective? Do you see like new things that you didn't see before in the city?
You know what's funny is one of the weirdest mind tricks you can play on yourself is when if you haven't been somewhere in a while and you walk down that street and like re-walk the path you used to walk. So I actually did this the other day because I had like an extra hour of time and I went and walked back through the same path that I used to walk to school, like around the Capitol and like do this path. And I was like, oh my God. And your mind starts reflecting on what a different human you are and like the way that you see the world. And I remember just like what type of thoughts were going through my head when I was in school here and just like the completely different versions of myself that I've been.
Yeah.
So it's really cool to come back and like touch base, and that's when you really witness your own growth.
Yeah.
So it's been beautiful. Completely different human that I was when I went to school here, for sure.
Yeah, that's cool because I bet you that gives you a moment in time to just reflect on what you were worrying about at that time and how insignificant some of those worries actually were into the person that you've grown into today. It's like, why was I worrying about those things as I was taking these steps however many years ago it was?
I was taking the CPA when I was in school here. So yeah, completely different. And now most of my waking time is talking about mushrooms for a living. So
All
yeah,
mushrooms.
You don't need a CPA for that?
It's actually, it's actually been very useful for varying degrees of things. But yeah, it's been a trip.
It's one of my favorite things to do when I go back home to New Jersey or New York City, because before doing Meat Mafia, moving to Austin, I used to walk a ton. So I love going down to like the water in the financial district where I used to work, or like even certain paths in New Jersey. And I'll walk back those paths and have the same reflections that you're having, thinking this was only like 2-3 years ago where I was living here, but I feel so different. And I do remember those quality of thoughts that I used to have. And to Harry's point, it makes you realize that a lot of those problems were insignificant, but it also makes you proud of yourself because you realize how much you've changed. Literally, when you were here, you're studying for the CPA. Now you're the founder of Super Mush, this incredible CPG brand. You're doing so much for adaptogenic mushrooms, introduction into like psychedelics and plant medicine, and all this great advocacy for the work you're doing there. So I feel like you've when we caught up at Sun Life a few days ago when I first met you, my initial reaction was like, you've kind of lived like 3 or 4 lives in one at a very young age, which I'm sure you get a lot. So I think it would be cool to give the listener a little bit of context and backstory into you from the consulting days, the accounting days, the modeling days, to now being this amazing founder of this brand.
Yeah, I've tried on a lot of different versions for sure. What feels most present to share? I always kind of tell my story, if you will, differently every time I think about it. But a lot of what has happened over the course of my life is I think I've tried on a lot of different things, like taking it all to the extremity and like seeing what resonates from that area. And like what my current version of life is like pulled on the best parts of all of those. And that's still a continued journey. Like when I'm reflecting on that walk, that feels like 15 people ago.
Yeah.
And the 6 month ago version of me felt like 2 people ago, because so much I feel like I'm changing at such a rapid pace, which I love. But like the chapter points of my story. So first of all, I'm from Missouri. I'm from the middle of the country. And I was talking about this yesterday, but it's like pretty comedic what I'm doing now because I grew up with the DARE program. I grew up with like Just Say No to Drugs, pretty conservative Christian upbringing. And my original path in life led me down, I was a huge partier in high school, mostly based around alcohol. And when I went to college, I Googled #1 party school in America with my sister. I'm a triplet, so there's three of me. So my sister and I wanted to go to school together. Our brother stayed back and went to school in Missouri, went to Florida State. And because of, I was always a really good student, so I always like tested out of the classes that I needed to take. So I had like a lot of freedom in what I wanted to explore in college. And so I tried on a little bit of everything. I wanted to be a sex therapist originally. So I started to get my degree in human sexuality. They took away that degree the year that I was there. So I was like, okay, I got to pivot. I was going to drop out of school, join the Peace Corps. That was like next passion area. And then through a variety of different conversations and awakenings that I had, I realized that I wanted to do the hardest thing I could possibly do, school-wise, make a lot of money and be able to like, have resources so that I could apply them to the things that I really wanted to do in the world to make, what in my mind at that time was like a really big impact. And so I kind of did this hardcore pivot. I went from like I was a bartender all in college. And this all kind of like loops back to what I'm doing now, but bartending in college, like really into hosting parties. And I still do a lot of that now. So like there's a through line for sure. And then I did this pretty like hardcore pivot and went to UT. Went to UT Austin. I stopped drinking. I started to take my health really seriously. I started to like, we were talking about at Sun Life the other day, kind of like the process of extracting myself from the Western medical system because I had been like in and out of it for gut problems I'd had since I was a baby, since like before I can remember. And I started to like really become my own citizen doctor and study the healthcare system and like start to unwind all of these paradigms that I had in my head around like outsourcing my healing in a lot of ways. And that was really here in Austin, which is beautiful. It was like also simultaneously the start of my spiritual journey. And so did that. I got my master's in accounting and my CPA, and then I went to work in corporate. Very passionate about the U.S. healthcare system and how fucked up it is. And wanted to play a part in creating like a more value-based healthcare system. I very quickly realized that I wanted to work in wellness after like a bunch of crazy stories, and I worked for Ernst & Young for a while. Amazing experience. And then like through that entire process, I started to become familiar with functional mushrooms, and I felt like they took my health from an 8 to an 11. So like it was the first time my body fully experienced flow states. Like the substances that I was taking were obviously not serving me. So I got off all my Western medications, started to discover functional mushrooms, and became obsessed with fungi from that perspective. And then simultaneously was studying the psychedelic space when like early days when Tim Ferriss's of the world were like first starting to come out and talk about it and fund it. And then was fascinated with the fact that like functional mushrooms are fungi, as are psychedelic psilocybin mushrooms, and no one was really talking about them holistically at that time. And so became a student of that space, quit my corporate job, started modeling to fund my first startup. I had a wellness startup before this, and started also like hosting a ton of events, just like really widening my aperture and like the way that I thought about the world, building a really cool community in New York at the time. And yeah, I just like continued to follow down the path of obsession with functional mushrooms, met my co-founder at a retreat, convinced him to start a company with me.
Yeah.
And yeah, that kind of like led me to everything that I'm doing now.
Was there a moment in time where you were going from this like heavy party stage to starting to have these realizations about your health that you can think of that really made you turn that corner and be like, I actually really need to start taking my health more seriously? Or was it kind of like a smooth progression to finding some of this?
I think what I started to realize is, and this is not new information. If anyone's listening to this podcast, it's probably stuff you guys talk about all the time. But my like awakening moment was really like following the money around pharmaceutical medications and realizing that everything that we're prescribed can often be directly related to profit margin. So if you look at like all of the misdiagnosis I had and like look at where that prescription was coming from, it was like very directly related to profit margins. Like the pills I prescribed had the highest profit margin and were like the most commonly prescribed pills in the United States at the time. And so I was like, oh, this makes sense from that lens. And I stopped, I guess, outsourcing my healing once I realized where the information was coming from. And a lot of what my current, this is kind of like a pivot answer to your question, but like a lot of what my current obsession is, that was very much informed by my earlier path in life, is the substance journey. And like, you know, the average American, like the path that we go down is so fascinating because so much of our lives can be informed by the substances that we take. Not the entirety of it, but I was even having this thought yesterday because I accidentally, I ordered a decaf coffee and I was given a regular coffee. And I like, for someone that doesn't drink a lot of caffeine, if you drink, you know, 200 milligrams of caffeine, like I felt like my heart was exploding out of my chest and I felt angry and I felt like so wired. And caffeine has a time and place, and like I drink a little bit of it, but the point is I like just was reconnected to how imbalanced most of our nervous systems are because we're like taking crazy stimulants and then crazy, you know, substances to counteract the effects of those stimulants all the time. Yeah. And so like the path that most people are put on, like mine included, is, you know, you are born and you're exposed to all of these microplastics in food, these toxins, sugars at a really young age, like all these processed foods. Then around like age 4 or 5, your parent may take you to the doctor because they're like, my kid can't focus because you're put into a school system where we're not, you know, using our creative brain and like not operating in any sort of flow state. We're like really putting kids in very operational, structural, you know, structured environments where we're not expressing our artistic talents in any way. Yeah. And so then, you know, you will start to be stacked on all of these medications and pills. And so much of that path is like there's no education around it. And so by the time, you know, people go to college, they're often like on 4 or 5 different medications, ADHD medications, SSRIs, sleep aids, et cetera. And so I was lucky enough to come to Austin and like extract myself from that system because I had the time and space to like really look at my life in a different way because I had this like kind of gap year, I guess, of grad school. So it's like such a blessing year in my life. A lot of people are just thrust into the corporate America system. And then you get to the work to get to Friday mentality, alcohol, caffeine, other stimulants may be involved. And so your brain and body is just completely out of balance. And so one of the things that I'm the most passionate about is like I extracted myself from that system and was like, I'm high on life. This is incredible. I will never engage with any substances ever again. And then started studying the psychedelic space and then realized that there is this whole smorgasbord of things to alter your consciousness with that can make you a better person, happier, healthier, more conscious, alter your brain in a different way, like get you into your heart, less into your head. Because all the substances I was taking was getting me, they were going the opposite direction. Right. Productivity, obsession, into my head. And so that's kind of what developed my passion for that space. So I studied it for a while and then started to explore other things that I can alter my consciousness with.
Yeah, there's such a clear connection between gut health and brain health. And it seems like there was a very awesome progression for you where it's like when you finally start to take your health seriously and kind of clear out some of these chronic gut health issues that you had for your entire life, which is similar to what I had too, there's like this clarity of thought that comes from that. And you start to explore what else is out there. How else can I improve myself? Where you're very interesting because when you were telling me your story at Sun Life, there wasn't necessarily this need to take psychedelics where it seemed like there wasn't anything traumatic at the time that happened to you. You just kind of wanted this like deeper exploration. It was like, is there a deeper version of Alli that I can maybe take myself to? And I think a lot about Tim Ferriss's impact in the psychedelic community and Aubrey Marcus, because it was really like 2016 to 2018, they were putting out a lot of really like educated work and research on that topic. And I think they really legitimized the space, especially someone like Tim, who's experiments on everything. He's so diligent. He's so smart. As soon as he started talking about the positive connection between his depression and the way he was able to effectively like mediate some of those things through psychedelics. Like I think there were so many people that started to really be like, all right, there's probably something here that I should go deeper on. And it sounds like you were a byproduct of that too.
Yes. And there's so much nuance to this conversation. Like what is being legalized across the country right now is psychedelic assisted therapy for like very issue specific things. Like most of the trials are on PTSD, depression, anxiety, eating disorders. Like there's hundreds of trials going on. And that's all amazing. And then you have like this whole other group of people that are using psychedelics for human optimization, so to speak. And so like the way that I like to think about it is, you know, if you're using psychedelics for like really deep healing, it's kind of bringing you from a 0 to a 5, like can't get out of bed in the morning, or not really like functioning in society, to like healthy, normal state. And then there is the side of using psychedelics for human optimization, healing. So kind of like taking you from healthy, normal and exploring like deeper parts of yourself. And there's always like an overlap. There's always healing involved, whether it's whether you're microdosing or not. Like there's this Venn diagram. There's like stuff that always lives in the middle. But my interest in it originally peaked from the human optimization side of things. And then like I discovered so many deeper layers of like things, I guess, that needed to be healed within me, but it wasn't birthed from a place of trauma, like to your point. And then where it's kind of taken me and where I've landed, and we kind of chatted about this a little bit, but all of my work with psychedelics was so important in the process of understanding death and grief in a totally different way, and like preparing for that process in my life. My dad passed away a little over a year ago. And one of the most impactful things was all of the work that I've done with psychedelics to like kind of prepare me to experience grief in a different way. And it's like this whole, there's a lot of context to that situation, which we can, you know, dive into. But I realized that a lot of what I saw around me, what you can call it trauma, you can call it nervous system dysregulation, whatever it is like a product of not being able to process grief well. And so because, you know, I had that experience after psychedelics, I had such a juxtaposition of, oh my gosh, you know, psychedelics give you this more natural understanding of grief, death, you know. And so that was also such an important process of like preparing my nervous system to go through that.
Yes. That was something that I was fascinated by, the way that you were explaining how just some of the things that you noticed with the Western grieving process, where it's kind of like have the service really quickly, go to that service, and then it's like, all right, this event is kind of done. And then you kind of like shutter up those emotions, and people grieve so differently. Like I know someone whose dad passed away 2 years ago, and it's hitting him now because he was like the older brother. So he was being really protective to his younger siblings, making sure they were good. Didn't really worry about himself. And now like 2 years later, he's getting hit with all those emotions of grief right now. And it sounded like for you, when your dad did pass, that there was like a very particular way you wanted to like celebrate his life and make sure you were there for your family. So if you'd be comfortable sharing that, I think that could be super helpful for other people that are experiencing that heavy, heavy loss of a parent or a sibling or something like that.
Yeah. It's been a beautiful journey. And I also found out in like a really interesting way. Actually, I wrote something about this. I'll send it to you after the show. Like I kind of, it took me a year to feel comfortable sharing it because it still was like, it was so fresh. But I found out my dad passed away on the way to, I was in Costa Rica at this juice cleanser retreat. So I also hadn't eaten food in 7 days, which is like an interesting element of the story because we're talking a lot about like gut health and how connected it is to our brain. So like my gut was super clear and therefore my brain was super clear in a different way. But I was on the way to the Liberia airport from Costa Rica to fly back to Los Angeles. I found out that my dad stopped breathing on the way to the airport. I was on the phone with my friend and got a message, and it was like completely out of nowhere. And so there's like a lot of details that happened in between now and then. But basically like as I was taking off on the runway, I got on a plane to go to Georgia. And as I was taking off on the runway, my mom called me back and told me that my dad didn't make it. He stopped breathing, and I literally lost service and was in the sky for 5.5 hours by myself. And the reason why I'm sharing that, and the reason why it's an important part of the story, is like I was able to completely make my own interpretation of death without all this outside input from a very like kind of Western processing. Usually when that happens, you're like on the phone with everyone. You're getting all of this input into your own, you're not able to separate and make your own interpretation of it. So I was given this gift in a lot of ways. And I also had a ketamine lozenge with me, which I'm legally prescribed to. And it's like a very low dose ketamine lozenge. And it's ketamine is very, very, like in PR world right now is very like stigmatized and misunderstood. And there's like a lot of truth to the reality of ketamine addiction and all of these things. It's also been an amazing, really impactful part of my mental health and hundreds of people that I know. So all of them are true. And I wrote about this in my story. I almost even like left it out because I was like, oh, I don't want to like, I don't want to like include this and or have it be misinterpreted. But I was like, this is a super important part of the story. If I were to take a Xanax on the plane, no one would have questioned it. Anyways, so I had that with me and I was able to kind of like dissociate from the panic attack that I was having. My body was having like a full panic attack because I was in so much shock that this had happened. And I had an amazing, really beautiful, life-changing experience being able to process my dad's death in this like steel tube in the sky surrounded by strangers by myself. And so by the time I'd landed, a lot of the lessons had kind of like integrated in a weird way and enabled me to like go and experience like the process of grieving him in a completely different way than I otherwise would have. And a lot of my experience was also informed by all the previous work that I had done with psychedelics. So it just gave me a different vantage point and made me really aware of like how when we process death in the West, like we literally, you know, we take bodies, we freeze them, we put them in boxes and then we bury them. And then we, you know, we have a few ceremonial funerals, wakes, but there's not, at least in my world, there wasn't a lot of like really deep connected understanding of what death meant. It kind of just happened and then we moved on from it. It was just didn't feel integrated. And so, psychedelics have been a huge part of that process. And mushrooms, my understanding of mushrooms and like how they operate are also so informative of the way that I see death. Because mushrooms literally, like they eat death. Fungi literally decompose dead materials and return it to the earth. And so in the West, we interrupt that process by the way that we even treat, you know, deceased humans. And so it was just such an interesting full circle and like coming together of a lot of these lessons. I don't remember what your original question was.
I think it was just like, no, you're answering it right now. Just the things that you were very mindful of during that experience with your dad to make sure that you and your family like were grieving the right way and really honoring his life in a way that's very different to the traditional Western process of grief.
Yeah, and a lot of what I think is really interesting about this that I've been reflecting on is just, you know, in Eastern cultures, there's so many beautiful examples, like whether it's India, Tibet, Indonesia, like the grief and mourning process is so elaborate and so beautiful. And in Western world, everything, one of my teachers said this to me and I loved it, is everything in the West is designed to make us forget that we're going to die. And you can see that from, you know, obsession with longevity to, you know, I was walking down the street in New York a few months ago and I saw this thing that said, erase your smile lines. And I was like, oh, that's so funny that we're literally conditioning people to erase history of emotions from their faces and conditioning, especially women, like as with aesthetic and beauty, to forget that they're going to die. And we don't have this like reverence for aging and reverence for even elders that other cultures do. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons that psychedelics and mushrooms have taught me is just to like really have this respect and reverence for death and to welcome it. And it, especially in the world of like, I love biohacking and like all my best friends are biohackers. And I want, you know, to really like clearly differentiate between that with myself of like, am I doing something for like longevity to live better, but also never to like escape death because no one has been able to do it thus far. So it's been a huge part of my like recent lessons from mushrooms. It's like super front of mind.
It's interesting hearing you talk about this, because just our model of thinking around death can be transposed into basically like every area of life. And you see how we think about things in this very mechanistic way. Like you were talking about school earlier, and how we have kids in very much a box where they're, learning this one subject, and then they don't really get to kind of experience things in this way where it's actually how life works, where it's very interconnected, and there's multiple different disciplines that are being applied. But we try to like make everything like a industrialized conveyor belt where, we process things in a vacuum. Like even when you're talking about death, I'm thinking about how we put old people in retirement homes, and we almost start distancing ourselves from the emotions even during that process. So we have this way of detaching ourselves from very important human processes. And for our show, it's like we have detached ourselves so far from the food system that we no longer know where our food is coming from, and we don't have that reverence for the life and death that went into creating food. So now we're living in this world, in the Western world, where things just show up. We don't really have that gratitude for the process in terms of how it got there. And it's very much just this industrial, mechanistic way of approaching basically every aspect of life in the West, that I think, really programs us to have that detachment and not be prepared to handle grief and things that are just ultimately going to happen in life.
And a lot of it comes from the fact that we don't know the history of anything. If you really look at like most of the problems, like even if, as I was telling my story, like most of my awakening came from understanding the history of a lot of these things. Like my obsession with sexuality originally came from like questioning, like, where does the construct of marriage come from? And like, how was sexuality, what was the state of the state with sexuality in like Plato, Aristotle, Socrates era, like completely different. Yet like so much of the downstream belief systems that we adopt, like modern conservative democracy, come from those people, but they operated completely different in the world of like sexuality. And that was a huge awakening for me. I was like, oh, we're piecemealing things that serve, a lot of capitalistic principles and just implementing them into current life. Same with the food system. Like I didn't have any consideration. Like we didn't know recycling was a thing when we grew up, because we don't question like where things go, where they come from. And that sounds really stupid to say it out loud, but like if you're not conditioned, if you grow up in like kind of a cave or a box, so to speak, like you don't question these things. And same with psychedelics. If you look at the history of psychedelics, every human society since they have been documented, every human culture has altered their consciousness since the beginning of time. And if you look at the way humans' brains developed, whether you believe in the stone ape theory or not, like you can literally find fossilized cave people that have a reishi mushroom, which is a non-psychedelic functional mushroom, which we can talk about more, and a psilocybin mushroom in the other hand. These are fossilized cave people. So they've been a part of human culture forever. Cave people, and a lot of the stuff I'm sure you guys are talking about is like how to return our diets and the way that we're living to when humans were thriving and didn't have all the modern diseases that we have. And so like really understanding the history of things is such an unlock.
There's definitely these interesting parallels between nutrition and psychedelics for sure. I was on an interview last week, and one of the things that I said was like the concept of eating like raw liver, offal, or organ meats makes people squeamish and uncomfortable. And what I said was that the hot Cheetos should actually make you uncomfortable, not the organ meats. And it reminds me of what you said too, of like there's definitely a subset of people that would be like, why did you take a ketamine lozenge when you were taking off on the plane? Yet if you'd experienced such traumatic news and you took a Xanax, no one would question it at all. It's like we've really just normalized a lot of things that shouldn't ultimately be normalized. And I think the history, to your point, is such a huge unlock of what we should ultimately be doing.
And a lot of what is really, just to like double click on that point, something I love to think about and talk about is, even now, like in the mainstream, like psychedelics are becoming sexy and cool, and there's a different reverence for them because the legal system is kind of catching up, and the studies are kind of catching up, even though these are fungi that grow in nature. Like the movements to decriminalize them are called decriminalized nature. So it's funny that we've criminalized these substances to begin with, and the process now of like the legal system catching up is starting to rework people's brains. But there's a really great book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Dr. Carl Hart. And it goes through each compound and shows how it actually affects your brain. And what it really kind of points to that's really fascinating is so many of the things that are acceptable in society, whether it be like ADHD medications, like if you were just to say Adderall and compare it to the chemical profile of meth, it's very similar. And so a lot of things that we're stigmatizing and condemning are very similar to things that we deem acceptable, because right now in our culture, like what is legal is good. And something I love to talk about and just like reframe my own brain around is we live in a society that calls our medicine drugs and our drugs medicine. So anything that's ever actually healed me, truly ever actually healed me, has been what our society has called drugs. And anything that has ever, taken me away from my heart, into my brain, created this whole montage of other problems is what our society calls medicine. And so the languaging around these things are really interesting. And it's so cool to see the legal system kind of catch up because the way that we've been conditioned to think, there's a large part of culture that's only going to shift perspective once the legal system tells them that this is now acceptable.
Are you hopeful that the legal system can actually get there in a time frame that can actually start to help people deal and process with some of the grief, PTSD, depression that I think a lot of people in a lot of these use cases are dealing with? And it's the type of grief that's like, we had Kelsey Sharon on our show who was talking about, her military experience and how she has used psychedelics to help process a lot of that. And I think like those are like the most impactful use cases in a lot of ways for this type of medicine.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I think there's a lot of nuance and a lot of things to be cautious around. But if you were to kind of pull back and just look at the state of the world right now, like we're in the worst mental health crisis we've ever been in. Mental health is all-time low. Therapy is at an all-time high. Psychedelics are a huge, impactful tool in that journey. And again, like tool being the key word, like psychedelic-assisted therapy is the key, especially for people that are suffering from severe PTSD. Something that I'm really interested in specifically to this point, I haven't seen a ton of studies on it, but I think it's happening. And it was actually brought to my attention because I was sharing this story around my dad and the way I found out and like my processing of trauma and the ability to be essentially immediately neuroplastic. So like, within 10 minutes of finding out my dad passed away, I was in an airplane surrounded by strangers in a dissociated state. And it was so impactful for my processing of that trauma. And so like the idea behind PTSD is like you have a trauma, you experience a trauma, and then that trauma gets essentially stuck in your nervous system, creates inflammation because it's not able to process in and up and through. So you could both experience the exact same thing, or you and I could experience the exact same thing. And it lands in my nervous system as trauma. It doesn't land in your nervous system as trauma. And I'm really fascinated between like the time duration that happens in, because a lot of what is happening specifically with people in the military is they're experiencing these trauma, coming back from war, and then start to develop these crazy PTSD symptoms. So if you can interrupt that landing in the nervous system and help it move up and through, and also help reframe your brain's perspective around what that meant for your life, that's really interesting.
Definitely.
And so that's kind of point number one. And then point number two on the legal system, like, yeah, it's happening. Psychedelics are in their third wave, the third renaissance, or, there's so many different ways that people are speaking about it and don't really know exactly how it's going to happen. Like right now, the state of policy in the United States is we're legalizing psilocybin assisted therapy at service centers and then decriminalizing on either a state by state basis or on the local level. What I'm really excited about, and I love the work that, organizations like MAPS is doing to push through like MDMA, is going to be legal for PTSD later this year because of all the work that Rick and his team have done. And it's incredible. I'm really interested in microdosing and consumer products and that slight neuroplasticity that we can also give as tools to people that maybe are not ready to open their consciousness and rip open their experience with 5 grams of mushrooms. one of my friends said this to me and I loved it. It's like we're legalizing the entire bottle before we're legalizing a sip of wine.
Right.
And so I'm really interested in that subtle neuroplasticity, like sub-hallucinogenic experience. That's been a huge part of my mental health journey, of my cognitive performance. And I'm excited about where that's going.
Yeah, I feel I've heard you use the word nuance a few times in regards to psychedelics, which I think is a great term. And I've also heard you describe it as a tool. And we were talking about this, I think, a little bit at Sun Life. And you correct me if you think I'm wrong or if you have strong feelings about this, but I actually see some parallels between like faith in God and psychedelics. And I think I was explaining to you that Harry and I both made the decision to get rebaptized at the church, the Christian church that we go to in town, which has been an amazing experience. And it's very interesting to share that experience with people, because a lot of people that are in the millennial demographic have experienced what's called like church hurt, where like you went to a church, maybe it was like Catholic, Episcopalian, traditional, where you either didn't have a good relationship with God, maybe you had a bad pastor, a bad priest, something happened to you, maybe it was someone at the community that did something to you, and so you like harden yourself towards faith in God and religion in general. And the response to that is like, what you experienced, that wasn't actually God. Your heart shouldn't be hardened towards God. That was like a person's incorrect interpretation of God that did something to you as well. And then in the nuance that you're explaining in the psychedelic community is very interesting, because we are explaining that Austin is a very interesting spiritual city where there are people like you that are ultimately using it as a tool and taking a very like incredible approach, healthy approach to the way that they use psychedelics. And then there's also people that I think view these drugs as God, it's as the master versus the tool. And I think they give it a very bad rep for a lot of other people. So I think the nuance is there, but the way that you were explaining your journey with psychedelics just kind of reminded me of just some of the stuff that we've gone through the last year with like our Christian faith. So I don't know if you've ever explored that connection or you think there's validity there, but I just wanted to share that because I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, there's the thing that comes up for me, and it's an amazing book. If it's not an easy read because it's a pretty dense book, but there's this book that this guy Brian Marascu wrote. It's called The Immortality Key, and it is essentially a history of psychedelics, and the concept, like thesis behind the book, is essentially like the reason why we have 27% of the world that identifies themselves in this spiritual but not religious category is because we originally used psychedelics as part of religious sacrament. Like every Western religion that has been documented, he went in and found like the artifacts that have been like fossilized cups and things, and basically proving through like taking the archaeological remains of these cups that they were infused with infused barley, essentially, was the remains, aka psychedelic beers and wines. And the process of stopping to use those psychedelic sacraments as a part of religion is where you see this drop off in religion. So why this relates back to your point is a lot of taking psychedelics out of the church has caused this rift, and then people have kind of refound psychedelics but without the church. And there's this really great poem that I love. It's called Don't Trap God in Church. And so a lot of people have now found God out of church. And then I was talking to Mike, and he said, yeah, but you don't want to trap God out of church either. So it's like, how do you kind of bring it back together? And people are finding that. People are, so a lot of people identify as spiritual but not religious. And I think the point that you're kind of making clearly is a lot of times a concept and an ethos is so good, and you have one person that's not embodied that kind of ruins it for you. Like if you go to a church and you don't connect with the pastor that's speaking, or they don't feel like they're an embodied representation of that ideology, you kind of turn away from it altogether. And that's even what happened with my experience with religion. I kind of refound it through psychedelics. So, my teacher, one of my teachers that I've sat with in ceremony many times, like really emphasizes the point of exactly what you just shared, that they're tools and they are not, they are not necessarily like, God themselves. Like we kind of have a reverence. And again, we're like outsourcing our divinity in a lot of ways when we're looking at psychedelics. So they're tools to like awaken that within you. And there's a lot of people that are, people call it pseudo shamanism, whatever you want to kind of use the term as, where people are taking their own neuroses into psychedelics world and like kind of sharing the wrong message. And there's so many beautiful people that are using these tools and helping share them in the right way. So you can find all of it everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, the history of it too, you guys made me think about this. There's, it was the 60s and 70s when there was like this liberation of a lot of psychedelic drugs in the US specifically, but then there was also like on the backside of that, like a religious and spiritual revolution as well. So it makes me think that like we can't necessarily separate these two things from each other. Like when people do have a psychedelic experience, I've seen it more time than once, they end up starting to talk about God in a way that like, might not be the same way that we would talk about God, but like they start to have this higher level experience where they realize that there is a higher power out there. Like there is more to the story than what they were experiencing before. So I do think that the history of these two things like are kind of one and the same in some ways. Like there was a movie that came out recently called The Jesus Revolution. I think it was in the 80s or 70s. I'm not totally sure.
70s, yeah.
70s. And like that coincides exactly with like a lot of the revolution that was happening in psychedelics. So I don't know. I feel like we're kind of experiencing that now where people are starting to explore consciousness in different ways after having gone through, I think COVID might have been the wake up call for a lot of people where they started to reframe their thinking about, what are we experiencing? What, is there dark evil out there? Is there good out there? I think that it's forced a lot of people to start to question some higher level things.
Yeah. And I think COVID and that time period made people ask different questions and kind of like removed a lot of surface level conversation where people were getting to like the root of what's going on in society quicker. And like what it pointed to is a lot of things. COVID specifically, like it isolated us. So like it pulled us away from each other. The biggest takeaway, like the most common phrase you'll hear people that have gone through psychedelic experience say, and this is like documented in all the clinical trials, is we are all one. And what that means is they're experiencing this kind of like connection with other people in a more profound way than they have before, and realizing like we are all part of one thing. Or like so much of what COVID did was isolate us and literally draw borders across like where we're able to cross, and both invisible and like physical borders were created. And so a lot of what psychedelics can do is like reconnect us with the collective consciousness and make us ask bigger questions. The other thing I think is really, interesting and important to note here is if someone's listening to this and they're like, okay, I'm not ready to explore with psychedelics, there's so many things that can like create neuroplasticity in your brain and create these like same feelings and these same like awakenings without having to do psychedelics. Like a lot of what my world is actually functional mushrooms. Lion's mane is such an important tool. If you were to just put everyone's brain in the world on lion's mane, we would have such a better planet because it can create neuroplasticity in the brain. It can grow new neural connections. A lot of what like is actually happening, because a lot of this, and it might sound like maybe that's a good thing to talk about. It might sound like kind of esoteric or like tough to wrap your brain around, because what's actually happening, like if you're just to talk about psilocybin, when psilocybin goes into your brain, it's converted to psilocin. So it opens your visual cortex. So you're able to see more of what's actually there around you. And it removes you from your default mode network, where all of your habit loops and decisions and basically like this autopilot that we create throughout our lives lives. And so it, Michael Pollan describes it as fresh snow powder for the brain. So like, instead of going down the same ski slopes every day where like that groove is already built in. It's like the feeling of when you talk to your mom on the phone and you like have this crazy reaction and you drop back into being 12 years old again. Like that automatic response is able to be refreshed in a way, and you're able to think differently. A lot of people are scared of losing their mind, changing their mind. That is like the entire point. Your mind will change and you will grow new neural pathways in your brain. The brain scan images are so cool. And a lot of that same thing can happen with use of functional mushrooms, lion's mane being one of them.
Do you credit a lot of your experience with psychedelics to being like the catalyst for starting Super Mush?
You know what? It's actually no. It's inspired by, like, if you look at the branding, we have the brand for people that are listening. It's called Super Mush, and it's a very 60s and 70s inspired brand. Our vision is like, to kind of be Red Bull of mushrooms, but healthy is the way they're approaching the marketing model. So it's super fun, like festival focused, and it looks like, a Woodstock brand. It's really 60s and 70s and psychedelic inspired, but functional mushrooms are such a huge part of my journey and feeling incredible. And I worked with them for years before I ever really started working with psychedelics consciously. So really functional mushrooms was like the primary. And then I started to educate myself on psychedelics in a more conscious way, and then realized how important it was to use Super Mush as a platform to educate holistically around fungi. Because one of the things that is so fascinating to me that a lot of people don't know anything about is like actually like fungi. If we're just talking about fungi, it's like this whole kingdom, and we're more closely related to it as humans in the animal kingdom than we are even to plants. We share most of our DNA with mushrooms, and there's so many fascinating things that I wish that this would be taught in school. Like if there were just be a class taught in elementary school about mushrooms, I think it would be incredible. There's so many lessons you can learn from how fungi operate. Like if you guys ever heard of the Mycelium network, or do you know what that is?
I've heard of it, but I don't know what it is.
Yes, there's a really interesting paper by one of my buddies, and he wrote it like the Mycelium network and how early it's to Bitcoin, and it's like incredibly fascinating.
Yeah, you can use people are using fungi.
If anyone wants to just like go off on a deep rabbit hole.
No, and it sounds crazy, but it's not. So if you look at like the way that the Mycelium network is basically this vast interconnected web of fungal network that lives under every single step you take across planet Earth. It goes like 300 miles down. So every single living thing that comes out of the ground across planet Earth is connected by this mycelium web. And so like it is this mass, like, giant organism basically. And if you look at the way that we share nutrients underground, the mycelium shares nutrients, like collaborates with all these diverse species. There's like so much wisdom in that humans can take from mushrooms. And also like everything that dies, like mushrooms literally come out of the ground and eat it and return it to the earth. And so a lot of the concepts and like deep concerns that are really real around the planet and the state of our environment, it kind of points to the fact that the humans are the ones that are actually in danger. Like the planet is going to be fine because mushrooms will just decompose everything that happens and kind of start over. Like they're the digestive system of the earth. So the mycelium is fascinating, and to the point around Bitcoin and the internet, it operates very similarly to the Earth's internet.
Yeah.
So there's actually like AI algorithms that are using fungi to inform AI to make it more conscious. It's really interesting.
Yeah, it's I think a lot of amazing technological advancements just mimic nature. Like whenever you see some massive transformative technology like the airplane, it's like two guys trying to figure out how to design something that is already existing in nature. And I think we've tapped into that with the internet and things that are being built on the internet by looking at the mycelium network as how do we understand network effects, which is ultimately kind of like what the internet is being built into. So it's really interesting. I feel like we're not even close to fully understanding either of those. But one of the things you said that really was interesting to me is like the soil health and how, we will potentially cease to exist, but the earth will be fine. One of the most impactful episodes of the podcast that we've ever done was with Taylor Collins, who started Epic Bar, and now he has a ranch out in Fredericksburg, Texas called Rome Ranch. And one of the things he said to us was, I asked him, I forget the exact question, but it was essentially like, what's the difference between soil health and human health? And he goes, they're one and the same. Like the health of the soil will directly, over a long enough period of time, decades, be something that funnels into the overall health of everything that's on top of it. I think it was like a pretty profound way of saying what you said earlier, which is, we're all one. And as humans, we can think that we're different, that, we can exist in these like narrow industrial mechanisms, but if we forget about the fact that if we keep using chemicals to grow all these crops and it kills all the life in the soil, we're eventually going to be sitting here one day and not have any soil to create the food that we need. So I just think that there's a lot of value in like making that connection. Like the soil health is our health. Like we can't live without life in the soil.
And I think a lot of it just comes down to like, we're so disconnected from understanding nature. We're so separate from that understanding. Like I grew up without any of this knowledge, and an understanding of the history. Cause I just grew up with processed food and in a processed environment and everything that just felt normal to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then the more that I started to understand it, actually a huge connection point for me, and maybe people on this that are listening to this, it's one of the most common things that people deal with is mold poisoning. And the wisdom around mold poisoning of like going through that experience, basically like when you get mold poisoning, it's usually from a home. It can be from food, but most people get it from living in a moldy home because the way that we build homes in the United States is outrageous. We're basically just building like boxes that trap moisture in and create mycotoxins that we're then breathing in all day. So mold is a huge, huge issue that a lot of people deal with. And it is also comical because I got mold poisoning while I was building a mushroom company. So I was like, oh my God, they're literally inside of me. I can't escape it. But my lesson from mold was like understanding that mushrooms are literally eating the buildings because they're trying to decompose this non-natural structure and return it to the earth. And then I just I spun off on like the spiritual meaning behind this and the lessons. Like mushrooms are always trying to teach us lessons, whether it be the mycelium or the mycotoxins that are eating the buildings, or the psilocybin that's in our brain, or the lion's mane that's in our brain. I think they're always kind of trying to inform wisdom in humans. And so I had a lot of lessons from mold, but one of them was that, now after having gone through it, I'm so sensitive to being in a moldy environment. So my system recognizes that. And most people that have gone through it, they would never sleep in a moldy home because they're like, oh my God, I realize how much this affects my health. And then I had all these awakenings around like understanding that people are also like mold. So as important as it is to protect our physical environment, the things that we eat and all the things that you guys probably talk about on the show, like people are equally as impactful to us. So if you sit next to someone that has a certain type of energy because their nervous system is operating in a certain way, or like even as simple as someone being on like a high stack of pharmaceutical drugs, just as when you sit next to someone and you can feel that they're like highly caffeinated and it creates this like almost anxious response in your own nervous system, that's happening to us on like a subtle basis day over day over day. And so a lot of the illnesses that we develop are like a slow burn. They're developed after like every day of doing something in like a micro amount. And it just made me hyper aware of around like the energies that I surround myself with, the energies that I'm bringing to other people. The mold was like that wake up call for me because I realized how sensitive my nervous system is after that experience.
Wow.
Yeah. That's why I think one of the most impactful points that I'm taking from this conversation is just your willingness to study history. Because I think when you actually study history, you realize that like the secret to the future is really learning from the past too, which seems very counterintuitive, but it's absolutely true. It's like, I think you said anything that you thought was a drug was actually medicine. Anything that you were being pushed as medicine was actually a drug. And it's absolutely true with our food system too, right? It's like, I was basically told that, hey, I shouldn't really eat large amounts of meat and saturated fat, et cetera. That's ultimately what cured my stomach. You've been following like a paleo animal-based diet and you feel the best that you've ever felt, even though you're basically told that this is poison, this is what's ultimately going to kill you.
Yeah, and that's what, originally what we talked about, we were riffing on like what to call the episode, and you were like steak and sex gummies.
Yeah.
Because those are the things that I've like, that have been really incredible for me lately.
Yes.
And for context, we make sex gummies for Super Mush.
The sex therapy background makes more sense too. Why you guys make a sex
I
gummy.
realized upon reflection, accidental synchronicity there. But yeah, so and again, a part of what my journey was diet. So I cured a lot of my illnesses through food, and originally that was just like removing all processed food, but it was like when the vegan craze was really present. So I was vegan probably for 5 years or so, And then I was vegetarian, but then I started to have, like the very classic issues that a lot of women have, where like my hair was falling out and I wasn't getting my period. I was working out like a guy, essentially, like doing Barry's boot camp type workouts. I was also like in my modeling era when I was working in fashion industry in New York. So like all of that was like, leading to a very specific outcome. And it wasn't what was making me healthy. Like my body was literally not getting a period and not cycling to show me that like my nervous system was out of alignment and like I wasn't in accordance with my circadian rhythm. And so one of the things I started to do, actually as a result of mold poisoning, of going and seeing a few different practitioners, was they were like, you need to start eating meat, or you should explore to start eating meat. And I did. And very quickly my body was like, yes, this works for me. And it was very against what I had been learning and reading about and the people that I was following at the time. And everyone's system is different. So this isn't obviously a prescription, but like really what worked for me was starting to eat meat again. And then I got a little lazier with my diet. And one of the things that happened to me at the beginning of the year is I had someone read the stool test for me. And the stool tests are really interesting. But basically, I had this doctor read it, and he told me that I needed to stop eating all meat, basically all the things that were making me feel good. And it didn't feel right to me. So it was also like me learning to listen to myself and be a citizen of my own, be a citizen doctor of my own health journey. And I was like, actually, this doesn't feel right. I'm going to go like totally the opposite way and just be basically paleo and eat a very specific diet of essentially meat, sweet potatoes, like a few other like avocados, like very basic foods. And I feel the best I've ever felt.
Yeah.
I feel incredible. And I'm eating meat for almost every meal. And I've gotten a lot of different like signals from my body that this is working, and it might not always be the thing, but right now it's like really working for me. And it's funny that I was very anti that for a long time.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say you're not the only one. I feel like it's kind of pre-programmed into a lot of women that they should avoid red meat. I'm interested to understand like what, like, do you feel like you have an explanation as to like why you were afraid to eat meat previously? And I just think a lot of people could benefit from trying to understand like where that comes from and like what ultimately gave you that like inclination to be like, all right, like I should definitely just explore this.
It was, I mean, it's the classic like documentaries and the kind of the cultural zeitgeist around like the veganism trend. Like I caught wind of that and followed that. And there's a lot of amazing truth to what happens to your body, mostly from the removal of processed foods.
Right.
So of course you're going to start feeling better once you stop eating packaged processed things and just start eating whole real foods. And that really worked for me for a little bit. But I think on like a long-term sustainable basis, like my body was not hormonally balanced and does do really well with meat. I think it's also, there's so many factors around like what your ancestry is, like where your family, like lineage is from, like what foods they ate and the cultures they were, for hundreds of years. Like so much of, I think what people don't understand is like how much of our DNA is passed on. They're literally doing studies specifically in the psychedelic space right now, which I think points to this really clearly, because there is not one size fits all for anything. But they're doing studies to show that symptoms of trauma can skip a generation even and show up in the DNA of our grandchildren, our children. They did this really interesting study with women and survivors of sexual abuse, where the daughters and the granddaughters are showing symptoms of PTSD from sexual trauma, even though nothing happened to them in their lifetime, but it lives in the nervous system, the DNA of the mother. And therefore, you're birthing this child that carries your DNA in your nervous system. And so it's carrying on in your lifetime.
That's crazy.
It's really fascinating because a lot of things that we can't figure out, we know that we have, we're affected by our parents, but I don't think we really understand how much. And so I think that's a really good parallel to draw with food, where so much of, your gut imbalances, like mine for sure came from, when you're in the womb, and prior too. So a lot of things that I needed to cure were really helped through that process.
Yeah. And you develop such amazing intuition by giving your body the right nutrients, where you can have a doctor that's telling you to give up meat, and then you end up developing the right perspective, which with the right relationship with your doctor, where it's like, I'm viewing my doctor just as a consultant, not the CEO of what I'm ultimately supposed to be doing with my own body and my own health. And so many people don't have that confidence. And it's a shame that a lot of people, and this person seems like they were functional, so I'm sure they were probably like well ahead of the curve of most Western medicine. But a lot of people just feel like, hey, if my doctor tells me to follow this type of eating or this type of prescription, I just blanket do it and I don't question. Where it's like, if you probably gave up meat, you would go back to your hair falling out, not feeling great, not having a period, which is like, you should just intuitively have like a great hormone cycle, great hair, great skin, all from giving your body the right nutrients that it actually needs to thrive.
So the thing that came up for me as you're talking is, I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, but it's the process of outsourcing your health in general. Like, we're always looking outside for the answers. And a lot of what psychedelics do, a lot of like, and, you know, whether it's spiritual work, it doesn't have to necessarily be psychedelics, but things that give you a psychedelic-like state, meditation, cold plunging, breath work, is they help you trust yourself, like really deeply trust yourself, because you have your own, you know, the entire context and the entire vantage point. I was one time, this woman came up to me. I was at Burning Man. This woman came up to me and was like, I want to pull a tarot card for you. And you're like, of course, at Burning Man, this is, you have to say yes to this moment. And she pulled this card for me, and it was a photo of a broken mirror. And the analogy that she gave me and the reading behind that was really impactful, based on things that I was contemplating in my life at the time, where she was like, you have the full picture. You have the full mirror. Everyone else sees a little shard of glass of this bigger mirror. Even someone who like knows you so well and is so deeply ingrained in your journey still doesn't have 100% of the full mirror. Like, you have the full context. And I think it's a really good analogy of trusting yourself and being able to be intuitive with what to eat, who to be around, what to do with your time. And that process is like a slow understanding and a peeling back of a lot of these layers. And most of the layers for me have been pharmaceutical drugs, you know, maybe toxic relationships, food, whatever it is, and like peeling those back. And then when your system is clear, your nervous system is aligned, then you can really be intuitive and directive with your path in a way that you could not have the clarity to do so before.
I've been interested to ask this question since you mentioned it, but how has being a triplet kind of helped you contextualize the world? Because I feel like you just said like everyone's a shard of glass. Well, you have like two other mirrors who kind of understand almost exactly kind of like who you are, where you're coming from. You guys literally came into the world together, so like are probably experiencing life in your own individual ways, but it's very interconnected. So curious, like, how has that been? Are they along for the same journey as you are? Would love to just like dive into that a bit.
We have a really weird birth story. Do you want to hear it?
Yes.
Okay. So my mom had trouble having children, and she had 2 miscarriages and they were in the adoption process. So she thought she could never get pregnant. She was told she could never get pregnant. They were in the adoption process. My aunt had a dream, said God spoke to her, went to my mom and was like, I want to have a baby for you. I think I'm supposed to be a surrogate for you and have a baby for you. My mom was like, what? And they ended up doing it. They ended up going down this path. And at the time, this is in Missouri, found a doctor. My aunt searched all over the country to do in vitro fertilization, which was very taboo at the time. It was very still like messing with the hand of God, where we were from. And they did it. They did in vitro, and they made 6 eggs in a petri dish, all my parents' DNA, my mom and my dad's DNA. They put 3 eggs into my aunt, and they had these 3 leftover eggs. They put them into my mom. They both got pregnant at the same time. So our triplethood is like, we're triplets because we were conceived at the same time, but we were born in 2 different moms, 2 different years, exactly a month apart. My siblings are born on Christmas Day. I'm born the next month in January 25th.
Wow.
And so that was like how our life started. And I feel like it's important context to the story of like, we didn't share a womb, and that's interesting. But I guess the journey of of being a triplet is like a therapist's dream in so many ways, because you get this like relentless feedback that a lot of people don't get at a young age. And it's like an ultimate case study in nature versus nurture. And we're all so different. I love my siblings, and we're, best friends and incredible, but like so many different archetypes of humans within this, like, within the three of us.
Yeah.
But it's been an amazing, amazing journey, and like such a cool reflective point throughout your life, because you also see how deeply your environment impacts you when you have two other humans that were raised in the same little pod as you.
Yeah.
The same year, everything.
I've never heard a birth story like that before. That's
weird.
incredible.
It's super weird. And the best part of the story too is they were like these tiny, cute preemie babies, because they were born a few weeks early, and they were 5.5 pounds. And then I come out, they're like so cute. The photos of them, they're adorable. I come out, I'm 10.7 pounds. I was like, emergency C-section. I have a giant cone head. It's really intense. I'll show you a photo of it. Yeah, so I was literally double their size. So it's just a unique. It was a unique start.
Yeah. Who was born out of your mom and who was born out of your aunt?
My aunt had me.
Okay.
My aunt had me. Yeah.
There's something to that. I mean, especially your mom, your parents not thinking they were going to be able to have kids, and then your aunt has this amazing vision, and you're able to give your mom like the ultimate gift, the gift of motherhood. That's so incredible.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Thank you to my aunt. And then something else interesting, which also relates to the food system, is we were moved, my dad got a job over in Taipei. So we actually grew up over in Taiwan for the first 7.5 years. And so the hormones are so different over there, like, because you're not exposed to the same, hormones in milk and a lot of things that are creating this early puberty in a lot of women, specifically over in the US. And so my parents said when they brought us back over, we were, I think, first grade, and the kids looked like teenagers compared to us. Like they were so much more like developed.
Really?
And my mom was like, what the hell? When she was like watching us come out of school one day, because she was like, we looked so young, because like we're expediting the puberty process through the early development and injection of hormones into a lot of our foods over here. That was also an interesting like parallel to look at.
Do you have any memories from Taipei that like stand out as, I mean, you were 7 when you left and came back to the States? That was early.
I mean, it's very full circle, but there a lot of things. But the thing that feels most relevant to this conversation, and probably what planted seeds of a lot of what my current obsessions are around death, is that they have a reverence for death in a really unique way. Their process of praying before, blessing their food. I remember my nanny in Taiwan, we would take out all the food of our pantry and bless it, like wave sparklers around it, like super interesting rituals that do not happen over in the United States. And we would, they have this thing called Tomb Sweeping Day. So over in Taipei is where we grew up, and it's like exactly what it sounds like. They would literally dig up the bones of their ancestors, clean them, and then rebury them, which was like a normal process. I remember walking to school and like watching this process happen, which is so different from how we treat and like have a connection to death in Western cultures. Like if you walked to school in America and saw someone like digging up bones and cleaning them, you'd be like,
arrested.
We need to call this person and get them arrested. It sounds like a scary movie, but that was like a part of what their process was of respecting, their deceased.
It's cool hearing you talk about these stories, because it's easy to see you now and understand who you are and what you're working on, because in the context of your whole story, it just makes a lot of sense. I don't know if you've heard that before, but your story is really, really powerful. And I think that like so many people are going to take value from it, not just from you starting Super Mush, but also just the learning from history and applying it to your everyday life, I think is a big takeaway for me. So just appreciate you coming on the show, and excited to call you a friend going forward.
Likewise, I'm so grateful to be here. And I think that the more conversations that people can share around you know, a lot of what I see you guys doing is like sharing what people's stories around being their own citizen doctor, whatever you want to call it, like taking ownership of their own health. And, you know, what we were talking about at Sunlight the other day is like the things that have healed me is hearing stories that resonated with me of people that were similar. They had, you know, similar illnesses or similar, even just like contemplations about their life and looking at what worked for them and taking a grain of salt from it. And so the more stories that can be shared of people and their healing journeys, I think it's incredible. So I'm stoked about what you guys are doing. I love that you call it Meat Mafia. Now I understand.
You're in the mafia. You're in the mafia now.
Is this the indoctrination?
This is indoctrination. Yeah.
Great.
We'll do steaks next time you're in town.
Love it.
Or we'll visit you in Southern California.
Please,
we're supposed
come
to be
Venice.
there. We're supposed to come out to do some shows this spring. So we'll definitely do something fun.
Come to Venice.
Yeah.
I have an amazing home. I live with 2 of my best guy friends. We have like it's just basically like open door. It's a community home. We have a ton of fun parties and dinners and a lot of really interesting social experiment events there. So you guys should come and hang.
That'd be great. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it.